Good.
Yeah.
Little more up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey everyone, my name is Brennan. Like Jamie said, I'm a community fellow at Augusta Health. I'm a farm assistant, and then I'm also the education coordinator. And so when I was asked to do a workshop, this was maybe a couple months ago, maybe February, January. And on a farm in February or January, there is not much growing, at least where we are. We have tunnels, and so we can grow a limited variety of vegetables, which mostly ends up being leafy greens like spinach, kale, some herbs, and some Swiss chard. So for the past couple months, I've been eating a lot of that and getting really bored of it also. So I've recently been looking at new ways to use leafy greens, and figured it'd be a great thing to share with everyone else. And so the first thing that I think of when I'm trying to use up some leafy greens is pesto. So most people think of just like your simple basil, pine nuts, olive oil, pesto that you'd see at a restaurant or in the grocery store. And that's probably what most people think of. But pesto can also include a variety of other herbs and greens and nuts, and it can really be a much different thing than that classic basil pesto. But yeah, I find pesto to be a great way to reduce food waste, get rid of greens from root crops like carrot tops and turnips and radishes. And it's also just an easy thing to use up a bunch of your random ingredients in the freezer or fridge. And it's also just a great way to eat more leafy greens, because we all know that we all don't eat enough of them. So the basics of pesto is just a ratio of leafy herbs or greens, oil, salt, hard cheese, and nut or seed and garlic. So that classic basil pesto that I talked about at the beginning is also known as pesto genovese, which originated in Genoa in Italy. It consisted of crushed garlic, pine nuts, salt, basil, and a hard cheese, which again is traditionally Parmesan. And for those other food nerds out there like me, it actually has what's called a PDO, which is a protected designation of origin. And what that means is similar to how champagne has to be made in the Champagne region of France, or tequila has to be made in the state of Jalisco in Mexico. Actual traditional pesto alla genovese has to have ingredients, specific ingredients from Genoa in Italy. So any Italians in the group, anybody watching, will probably be horrified by what I'm about to make, but yeah, pesto can be as creative as you want it to be. So historically, pesto actually has a couple predecessors, most notably in the dating all the way back to the Roman age. They had a food called maridum, which was a crushed garlic, salt, cheese, herb, olive oil, and vinegar. So slightly different than the classic pesto that we think of, but eventually made its way into what we know today. And although pesto genovese is the classic pesto most people think of, it's actually a pretty regional food within the country of Italy. There's Calabrian pesto, which has roasted bell peppers, and black pepper, which is notably absent from the traditional pesto recipe. And then also pesto rosso, which is from Sicily, contains mostly tomatoes and almost no greens, just a tiny bit of basil. But ultimately, the term pesto refers to anything that is made by pounding, or in our case today, we're going to be using a blender. But yeah, you can use anything from a traditional mortar and pestle, a blender, food processor, or if you don't have any of those, you can, and you have a lot of time on your hands, you can just use a knife. But again, today we're going to be using a blender. So today I'm going to start out by showing you all how to make a kale pesto. So we have some kale, from the farm. Yeah, so the first basic ingredient of pesto is going to be a green or an herb. It can be anything you want. Like today, I'm using kale, but I've also used collards, and it's really popular to use, like I mentioned previously, any tops of root vegetables like carrots, turnips, radishes, beets, you name it. As long as it's edible, you can turn it into a pesto. But also there's other things like garlic scapes, for example, that make a great pesto. Beets, just the actual root of the beet, or yeah, again, it's about as you can get as creative as you want with it. So for the kale pesto, I'm going to start by just deveining the kale, which honestly you don't even need to do, especially if you're using a blender or a food processor. If you really want to reduce food waste, you can just throw the whole thing in there, but it will definitely add a good bit of fiber, which might not be the best taste in your mouth, but again, totally fine and totally edible. And you can just take the stem out like this. My favorite way to do this is by folding any leaf like kale or Swiss chard or anything like that. I think the easiest way to do it is just by folding it in half, and then you can take your knife and just chop, right? Just slice the stem straight off, and then you don't have to kind of like carve your way around it or anything like that. Much quicker and a lot easier. And so for this basic recipe that I'm going to be showing you guys today, it's going to call for 2 cups of whatever leafy green you're using. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. But again, this is all just a suggestion. So if you try it out and you think there's not enough leafy greens in it, you can add more. If you think there's too much, you can add less. I think the fun of cooking is that recipes are always just suggestions, and you can change it as much as you want to fit what you like to eat. But so I've got all the stems here. I'm going to set them off to the side. I've got my kale here. Then the next thing you're going to need are a nut or a seed. So again, going back to our basic recipe, it calls for 2 tablespoons of a nut or a seed. Traditionally, you're going to use pine nuts, but I think pine nuts are really overrated. They're super expensive. They don't really taste like anything special. And yeah, who has time for that? So today I'm going to be using walnuts. I like to use walnuts mostly because they're cheap, but they also just have a pretty neutral flavor. They're easy to find, and yeah, they'll be perfect to kind of replace that nutty, fatty texture that the pine nut has. But you can really use any sort of nut you have on hand. Like I've done it with almonds, pecans. If you're into foraging and you forage a bunch of black walnuts, you could use those. And then my little extra special tip for today is going to be if you have a nut allergy or you want to make your meal nut free for whatever reason, I think pepitas, which are green pumpkin seeds, are a perfect substitute for any sort of nut. It has almost an identical texture to a walnut or something once you grind it up. And yeah, it'll make it so that anybody with a nut allergy can still enjoy what you're making. I'm just going to eyeball it. Again, 2 tablespoons. A couple walnuts in our blender. And so next is going to be cheese. So for the cheese component of our basic recipe, we're going to need half a cup of cheese, of grated cheese, that is. Traditionally, Parmesan is the classic. I would suggest using any sort of hard, salty, aged cheese. There's a lot kind of in that category, like Pecorino Romano, aged Manchego, aged cheddar, or Asiago. But again, ultimately, like I said, there's a lot of flexibility with this recipe, and you can really just use whatever cheese you have in the fridge. I can't guarantee it'll taste good, but there's definitely a lot of flexibility, and I'd encourage all of you to experiment. Yeah, and so if you want to make this recipe dairy-free or vegan, a great replacement for the cheese is going to be you could use nutritional yeast, just add like 1 or 2 tablespoons of nutritional yeast, or 1 or 2 tablespoons of miso. And what those 2 ingredients would do is kind of replace that umami flavor the cheese has, the salty, delicious taste that we all love. And then I'd also add maybe a little bit, a little pinch of extra nuts if you were to replace the nutritional yeast or miso, because obviously without the cheese, it's a much different texture, and the nuts will kind of replace some of the texture of the cheese you would have. Yeah, so I've just got a little half cup already grated out here, so I'm gonna add that in. And then next is going to be oil. So today we're just going to use normal olive oil, but I've used plenty of different other things as well. I just use whatever you have on hand. So I've used avocado oil before. I've used canola oil. Olive oil definitely has a pretty distinct taste compared to canola oil or avocado oil. So I tend to gravitate towards olive oil. But keep it flexible. If you don't have it in your pantry, don't feel like you need to run to the store and grab it just to make it taste good, because it can taste good with a variety of other things. Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't really think of any oil it wouldn't taste good with. Maybe stay away from sesame oil, both for your wallet and for just general taste. But most oils that people have in their kitchen will do just fine. And so for my little basic recipe, we are going to use half a cup of extra virgin olive oil. All right. And then last, we're going to use 2 large cloves of garlic. So I got my head of garlic here. I'm gonna crack 2 cloves off. And I think the easiest way to get the garlic out of the little paper that's on it is just by taking your knife, flat side on top of the garlic, and then just give it a good smack, and the paper will come right off. I think it's a great way to use it, unless you're gonna like grate the garlic into something else, then it can kind of get a little mushy. But if you're just throwing it in the blender like we're doing today, it's totally fine to crush it like this. I know a lot of people also will cut off the little root end of the garlic, which you totally can if you don't want it. Again, it might have like a tiny bit more fiber, but totally edible. And we're not going to, we're just going to toss it in. And yeah, so that's the basic recipe. Maybe we'll add another extra pinch of salt. We'll add something small to begin with, and we can always add salt later and just stir it in. But we're gonna add about those 2 cups of kale.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Let's hear the question.
All right. Yeah. So we have a question from Linda. If you avoid using oils for the health of it, what would you suggest as a substitute? Water, a chunk of zucchini?
Yeah. I had never even thought about a chunk of zucchini, but that would actually be really, that's something I want to try right now, actually. But what I've done traditionally, if like in the absence of oil, I've definitely been caught without oil at all. You can use lemon juice. So lemon juice will add another little zing to the pesto. Sometimes I even like adding lemon juice, even if I'm not replacing oil with it. Just a little bit of it can really make it taste a lot more fresher. And yeah, just give it another little dimension. But maybe a combo of lemon juice to water would be your best bet. Yeah, so now I'm going to blend this all up. If your blender is not wanting to blend it up, you can always add in a little more oil or water or lemon juice. But let's see if it. All right. And just like that, we have some kale pesto. And another thing I forgot to mention is it's totally fine to not cut up any of the kale or the, or the walnuts or the garlic. You can just throw them in whole and your blender will do just fine. So, oh gosh. If I wasn't talking, I probably could have done that in, 2 minutes, and I've already got, a really nice looking, super green, really healthy kale pesto. And so another, like I've mentioned before, you don't have to limit yourself to herbs or to greens, or your typical greens at least. You can also take something like a bunch of beets, and you can just one by one chop off the greens from the beets, just like you would the kale, taking the kale or the stem out of the kale. And you can just add all these beet greens to the blender, blend them all up, same exact ratio of everything. Blend it all up and it'll taste just as good. Then I would also recommend, if you're looking to try out something that's really unique, you can take the actual root of the beet, chop off the stem, chop off a little bit of the root. Then you're going to want to take a vegetable peeler and peel off this outer skin. Maybe toss it in a little olive oil or whatever you like to bake with. Put it on a baking sheet and roast for at 375 degrees until tender, which is usually going to be about 30 to 40 minutes. And then once you take those roasted beets out, you can use those roasted beets as a replacement for the greens, which sounds kind of wild, but I have already done that for you guys, so you don't have to watch me sit around while beets bake for 30 to 40 minutes. And it comes out looking just like your normal pesto, except really purple. And it's going to taste, again, great way to get your vegetables in. You're getting all, this is only like a beet and a half, and it's probably about the serving size I put on like some pasta or something. So it's a great way to use those vegetables you don't know how to use or don't really like and turn it into something that's super good, because once you got cheese and garlic and salt to anything, it's going to taste good. And yeah, so those are the pestos for today. As far as little variations you can do, like I said before, I love adding just maybe a tablespoon or two of lemon juice to the pesto, adds a really great second dimension to it. There's not really any acid, and acid is a really important part of most foods. So I think that's a great addition. And then number two would be roasting the garlic. You can just take the whole head of garlic, pour a little olive oil on it, throw it in the oven, roast it for a little bit, and it's gonna completely the flavor of garlic completely transforms when you roast it. It's gonna be a lot nuttier, and is gonna change the pesto almost entirely. And if you have the time for it, I really love doing that. It tastes delicious. Then next I'm going to talk about storage. So what do you do once you have this delicious green looking goo? So number one would just be throw it in an airtight container and put it in the fridge. So you could use a mason jar or any sort of leftover jar you have, or even like a Tupperware if you have a spare Tupperware. Throw it in the fridge and it'll last for about a week, which if you're planning on using it soon, will probably do just fine. Shouldn't be an issue. But if you're making a really big batch, planning on using it over an extended period of time, which is a great way to, like I said, if you have a bunch of kale in your backyard that is about to go bad, you can just huge batch of kale pesto and you can freeze it. So the best way to freeze it is going to be storing, again, an airtight container. You can use a mason jar or a regular jar because we're not canning it or anything. So as long as it's airtight, it'll do just fine. Or again, like a Tupperware if you don't have mason jars or any other sort of jars lying around. So you can just store it in an airtight container, throw it in the freezer, and that way it'll store for pretty close to 6 months, if not longer. I personally have had it last a lot longer than 6 months, but according to the internet, I should suggest 6 months. And then one little trick I like when I am freezing my pesto is you can pour it into ice cube trays, throw it in the freezer, let them freeze, give it maybe a day or two. And then you can pop out those little ice cubes of pesto into like a freezer bag or something like that and store that in the freezer. Then when you want to use it, you don't have to take out a whole like frozen jar of pesto and like smack at it with a knife to try to get your pesto out. You can just have it already pre-portioned in like 1 or 2 tablespoon sizes. Another way to do that, if you don't have an ice cube tray, is you could get a baking sheet, line it with foil or parchment paper or something, pour your pesto into it, use a rubber spatula until it's about a 1/4 inch thick, and then you can throw that in the freezer. Once that's fully frozen, again, after a day or two, you can pull it out, take a knife, and you can just cut it into little wedges or whatever shape you want to cut it into, throw it in a Ziploc bag, throw it in the freezer, and again, you're good to go. And you can just take out little pieces instead of having to thaw out a massive portion. And yeah, I think the next step would be, how do you use pesto? What can you use it in? I think the classic is obviously pesto pasta. Can't go wrong with that. But I've also used pesto in a variety of different ways. I think one of my favorites is as a base for a pizza. So you can just make some pizza dough or buy some pizza dough, use it as the base of your pizza instead of tomato sauce. And you can make really fun pizzas. I used to work at a brewery and we'd use the beet pesto as the base for a pizza, and it was one of our best-selling items for sure. Then I think another great way I like to use it is in a sandwich or on like a grilled cheese. It's a super great way to add another vegetable and get a little bite of freshness that you might not get otherwise. Or you can, if you're gonna roast some veggies like broccoli or asparagus or even potatoes, you can toss it in the pesto beforehand. And since pesto has so much oil in it, you don't need to add anything else. You can just throw it right on your pan, bake it, and it'll give whatever veggie you want a really delicious, garlicky, cheesy taste, which who doesn't love? And then last, you can also just get pieces of bread, and you can take your pesto and just spread it right on the bread. Or a little delicious snack, quick snack while you're maybe while the pasta's boiling, and you really just want to try that pesto before the pasta's ready, like I do all the time. And yeah, that's about all I have for today. I'm sure there might be some questions in the chat that I can answer now.
Okay, so we have, would broccoli work as the green in a pesto recipe, do you think?
I think I'm definitely a proponent for trying new things. So I think that'd be a really interesting idea. I'd say it's definitely worth a try. I think it might be a little fibrous from the stalk of the broccoli. But if you throw it in the blender for long enough, I don't see why that wouldn't work. If you can do a beet, you can definitely do something like broccoli for sure. I don't think there'd be any issue with that.
Great. Marianne also suggests you could save little sauce containers from restaurants to use to portion it out, which is a great tip. Any more questions?
Yeah, feel free to put any more questions in the chat, and while you're doing that, I can definitely send the recipe I referred to Jamie, and maybe she can email that out. But yeah, I think again, I'm a huge proponent of trying new things. So if you have an idea to replace any one of these items, I'd say go for it. And every time I've tried that, it's worked out wonderfully. And yeah, I think pesto is just a super great use for any vegetables you have lying around. Yeah, get creative with it. Find all those crazy things in the back of your fridge and make some pesto out of it.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, I will close this out. Just a few things. So yeah, thank you again so much for being here tonight. This was a really fun workshop for us to do. As Brennan mentioned, I'll be sending a follow-up email, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, just a plug for AMI, please check out our website, amifellows.org, to view all of our upcoming workshops. We've got a variety of in-person and virtual ones coming up. You can also sign up for our newsletter and follow us on Facebook and Instagram, where we always post about our educational programs. I'd also like to mention that we really appreciate donations. We try to make our public workshops free whenever possible, but we're only able to do that due to the support of our community. So if you're able, we welcome you to head to our website and make a contribution. Again, that's amifellows.org. All right, thank you everyone, and we hope to see you at another workshop soon. Have a good night.